It was a cool September morning in 1980 when the villagers of Elm Ridge woke to a quiet that felt different. Tucked away between thick woods and winding dirt roads, the small village had always moved at a slower pace. Church bells rang every Sunday, windows glowed softly each evening, and neighbors greeted each other like family. But on that particular morning, something in the air had shifted. It wasn't the weather, it was something else. A weight, like a shadow stretching across the cobbled streets and swaying trees. Something, or someone, was missing. By noon, word had spread. The 4 nuns from St. Mary's Convent hadn't shown up for morning mass. Sister Catherine, Sister Louise, Sister Margaret, and the youngest, Sister Angela, had lived in the convent on the edge of the village for over a decade. Known for their quiet kindness and deep commitment to faith, they were a constant presence in the village, visiting the sick, helping at the school, organizing the food pantry. No one could remember a day when all 4 of them were absent at once. Father Thomas, the village priest, tried to calm the growing unease. Perhaps they're on a retreat, he suggested to a group of worried parishioners gathered outside the chapel. Or maybe an unexpected visit to the nearby diocese. But even as he spoke the words, he felt a knot forming in his stomach. When the sun dipped behind the trees that evening and the convent remained silent, concern turned to fear. Local authorities were called, and a search was quickly organized. Neighbors, farmers, and even teenagers with flashlights joined in. They scoured the woods, checked the old well behind the convent, and searched the winding path that led to the river. Days passed, then weeks. Still no sign of the nuns. Their bedrooms were untouched. Beds made, Bibles neatly placed on nightstands, rosaries hung gently over headboards. The convent kitchen had a half-finished pot of tea, as if someone had stepped away for a moment and never returned. Nothing was stolen. No sign of struggle. No goodbyes. The police were baffled. So was Father Thomas. Speculation spread like wildfire through the village. Some whispered that they had run away, tired of their vows. Others spoke in hushed tones of something darker, something unholy. There were rumors of a drifter spotted near the woods that week. Some even blamed the old folklore about the forest being cursed. But nothing ever came of those whispers. Eventually, the search was called off. The case went cold. For years, the village of Elm Ridge mourned in silence. The convent doors were closed. A plaque with the sisters' names was placed in the chapel. Life moved on, but the emptiness lingered like a ghost. Father Thomas never forgot. He carried their memory with him each day. He lit candles in their honor every morning and left a place for them in every church gathering. He'd often walk to the convent in the early evening, sit on the porch swing, and whisper prayers into the fading light. But answers never came. Then, in the summer of 2008 to 28 years later, something changed. By then, Father Thomas was older, his hair silver, his hands slower, his eyes softer. He had served Elm Ridge faithfully through births, deaths, weddings, and baptisms. The village had grown quieter, more modern. Many of the old faces were gone. The chapel still stood, now worn but proud. And the convent, though still abandoned, remained untouched, preserved by time and respect. That summer, the local bishop had asked Father Thomas to oversee renovations to the convent. The church had decided to repurpose it into a retreat center for visiting clergy. At first, Father Thomas hesitated. It felt like disturbing something sacred. But eventually he agreed. Workers arrived, and dust stirred in corners that hadn't been touched in decades. Floors creaked beneath unfamiliar boots. The air was thick with old silence. But it was when the crew began work on the cellar that everything changed. There had always been rumors about the convent's basement. A sealed door, bricked shut for decades. Some said it was storage. Others said it was once a shelter during the war. No one had ever opened it. One morning, a young worker called out to Father Thomas. "There's something behind this wall," he said, his voice uneasy. "It looks old, like it's been sealed on purpose." Father Thomas walked down the narrow stairs into the cellar, the air cool and damp. He looked at the wall, then at the faded writing scratched into the brick. It was Latin. He recognized it instantly. "Deliver us from evil." His hands trembled slightly. The workers broke through the wall slowly, brick by brick. Dust filled the air, and light from a flashlight cut through the darkness beyond the wall. What they found would shake the village to its core. Behind the wall was a small chamber. Stone walls, dry earth, and something else. 4 wooden chairs arranged in a circle. On each chair, a nun's habit, perfectly preserved, as if waiting. And in the center of the circle, a small, locked box. Father Thomas stood frozen. Memories from 1980 came flooding back like a wave, crashing through him. He stepped forward, knelt by the box, and said a prayer before gently lifting it into his hands. The box was heavy, old, iron-bound. There was no key, but he could feel something inside shifting slightly with every movement. Papers? Bones? Relics? The room had grown silent. Even the workers held their breath. As Father Thomas carried the box up the stairs, his heart pounded in his chest. He placed it on the chapel altar and stared at it for a long time. He didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, he walked out onto the chapel steps and looked out over the village, just as he had done for nearly 40 years. But this time, something felt different. This time, he knew the silence was finally about to be broken. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat alone in his study, the box beside him, untouched. He thought about the sisters, their laughter in the gardens, their hymns during evening prayer, the soft sound of their footsteps in the chapel. He thought about the last sermon he gave before they vanished, about the look in Sister Catherine's eyes that day, like she wanted to say something but couldn't. And he remembered something else, a confession. 28 years ago, just 2 weeks before the sisters vanished, a stranger had come to confession, a man with a deep voice, trembling hands, and a story that chilled Father Thomas to his core. He had never spoken of it, not to the authorities, not to the church. He had buried it deep, believing it to be the desperate ramblings of a man with a broken mind. But now he wasn't so sure. As the village slept, a storm began to roll in. Thunder echoed in the distance, and rain tapped gently on the chapel windows. Father Thomas stood, took a deep breath, and reached for the box. But just as he began to pry it open, a loud knock came at the chapel door. Startled, he paused. Another knock, this one louder, urgent. He set the box down and walked to the door, unsure what or who he would find. When he opened it, no one was there, only the night. But resting on the chapel steps was a letter sealed with red wax, and scrawled across the front, in handwriting he hadn't seen in nearly 3 decades, was the name of a nun who was supposed to be long gone, Sister Angela. Father Thomas's hands began to shake as he reached for the envelope, and in that moment he knew everything they thought they knew about the sisters' disappearance was about to be rewritten, forever. Father Thomas stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the letter. The red wax seal shimmered under the dim porch light, like blood against parchment. He hadn't seen Sister Angela's handwriting in 28 years, but something inside him recognized it instantly. The looping S, the delicate slant, the way she dotted her eyes with little curves, he knew. His breath caught in his throat. A cold wind rolled through the chapel courtyard, sending dried leaves tumbling across the steps. He bent down, picked up the letter with shaking hands, and stepped back inside. He closed the chapel door quietly behind him, as if afraid to disturb the ghost now walking alongside him. The box sat on the altar, still unopened, but his eyes were now on the letter. He walked slowly to the pew, sat down and stared at it. The paper felt thick and heavy. Old, but not from decades ago. This letter was recent. Maybe days, maybe hours. He broke the seal gently and unfolded the paper. The writing was unmistakably Sister Angela's, but what he read only deepened the mystery. Father Thomas, if this has reached you, then time has already betrayed us. Do not trust what you think you know. The truth was never buried. It was hidden, and it is still watching. Forgive me, Angela. No date, no return address. Just those few chilling lines. Father Thomas felt his heart thudding in his chest. He looked around the chapel, suddenly aware of every creak, every flicker of candlelight. His thoughts raced. How could this be real? Was Angela alive? Had she been alive all these years? And what did she mean by watching? The weight of unanswered questions pressed down harder than ever before. The next morning, he returned to the cellar. The crew hadn't arrived yet, so he stood there alone in the narrow space behind the broken wall. The chamber still felt wrong, too quiet, too cold. The 4 chairs were still in their eerie positions. Their placement wasn't random. It felt ritualistic. He ran his fingers over the stone walls, looking for clues, carvings, anything that might help. That's when he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A faint line of symbols etched into the floor beneath the chairs. Worn, barely visible, but clearly intentional. Not Latin, not English. He didn't recognize the language, but it sent a chill down his spine. He stepped back, his thoughts pulling him into the past. In 1980, the nuns had seemed ordinary to the outside world. But Father Thomas remembered something strange from those final weeks before their disappearance. Sister Margaret had started visiting the woods more often than usual, alone, always near dusk. She'd say she was collecting herbs or walking in prayer, but something in her eyes hinted at more. Once, he'd caught her writing something in a small notebook, which she quickly tucked away when he approached. He never asked questions. Maybe he should have. And then there was Sister Catherine, calm, wise, and quiet. But 2 nights before they vanished, she had slipped into the chapel late after everyone had gone to sleep. Father Thomas had watched her from the shadows as she knelt at the altar and whispered something, over and over, faster each time. A chant, perhaps, a warning. He couldn't understand the words, but the urgency in her voice had haunted him. He dismissed it then, told himself she was merely tired or overwhelmed. But now, nothing felt coincidental anymore. Back at the church office, he dug through old files, journals, anything that might hold clues. In the back of a locked cabinet, he found a worn leather-bound book. Inside, tucked between old sermons and wedding records, was a single torn page with Sister Angela's name on it. It was a medical document. Blood test results. The date matched 2 weeks before the sisters disappeared. Father Thomas had never seen this paper before, and the name on the bottom, listed under Doctor, sent a shiver through him. Dr. Elias Morvan. That name hadn't crossed his mind in years. Dr. Morvan had been a private physician from the neighboring town, a quiet man who'd occasionally treated villagers when the local clinic was closed. He'd developed a strange reputation, not because of his work, but because of his intense curiosity in faith, miracles, and the intersection of religion with human biology. Some called him eccentric. Others whispered that he crossed lines no doctor should. Father Thomas remembered a particular visit. Morvan had come to speak with him not long before the nuns vanished. He'd asked odd questions about the sisters, whether they had shared dreams, whether they'd ever mentioned hearing voices, whether they bled differently. At the time, Father Thomas had thought the man was disturbed. He had ended the conversation quickly and never invited him back. But now, finding Morvan's name on Angela's medical form brought a sickening clarity. What had he found? What had he been looking for? More questions. No answers. That night, Father Thomas returned the box. He hadn't dared open it before, but the time had come. With trembling hands, he worked at the rusted latch. After several long minutes, it finally gave way with a soft metallic crack. He opened the lid. Inside was a folded white cloth, wrapped tightly. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a collection of items: a wooden rosary, scorched at one end, a silver locket, a torn page from a Bible with words circled in red ink, and the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. And beneath it all, a photograph, black and white, blurry but clear enough. 4 figures, the nuns, standing in a circle. But what shook him most wasn't them. It was what stood behind them. A dark figure, tall, shrouded, impossible to identify. Its presence loomed, like it was part shadow, part human. The photograph wasn't taken from inside the convent. It was outside, through the trees. Someone had been watching. Someone had documented it. His hands began to sweat. He carefully placed everything back into the box, except for the locket. He opened it. Inside, a small photograph of Sister Angela as a young girl. And behind that, a note. This time, not in Angela's handwriting. It read, "You should have listened. You still can, but you have to hurry, before the next 4 vanish." Father Thomas dropped the locket. It clinked against the wooden floor. He suddenly remembered something Sister Louise had once said during a prayer circle, her voice unusually distant. "Not all who kneel are saved. Some kneel to hide." At the time, he'd thought it was metaphorical, poetic. Now it felt like a warning. He stood alone in the chapel as thunder rolled again in the distance. Rain started tapping once more on the windows. The village outside lay silent, just as it had 28 years ago. But Father Thomas knew now this wasn't over. And somewhere in the shadow of Elmridge, something was stirring again. The next few days were a blur of questions, sleepless nights, and quiet dread. Father Thomas kept the box locked in his private quarters, away from the workers and parishioners. He knew if word got out about the cellar, the letter, the photograph, panic would spread through the village like fire through dry grass. Elmridge had buried the pain of those missing sisters for nearly 3 decades. Reopening the wound now, without answers, would only deepen the fear. But something inside him wouldn't let go. The phrase from the note, "before the next 4 vanish," echoed through his mind like a haunting bell. What did it mean? Was it a warning? A threat? Or had something already begun again? Father Thomas wasn't the only one sensing something strange. Across the village, subtle signs began to appear. At the local primary school, one of the teachers, Miss Hale, reported that a student, 8-year-old Lydia, had drawn something disturbing during art time. A group of 4 women standing in a circle, and behind them, a large dark shape with no face. When asked about it, Lydia just said, "They're back. The Watchers." The principal dismissed it as a child's imagination, but Miss Hale couldn't shake the feeling. She quietly brought the drawing to Father Thomas that same evening. He stared at it in silence, his fingers gripping the edges of the page. The image was too familiar, too precise. That same night, the bell in the old chapel tower rang once, though no one had pulled the rope. It was 3:11 a.m. In the surrounding countryside, locals began murmuring about animals behaving strangely, cattle refusing to enter the northern pasture, dogs barking at the woods for hours. A farmer, Mr. Callan, claimed he saw a figure standing in the fog near the river at dawn, but when he walked closer, there was no one there, only 4 indentations in grass, spaced evenly, like someone had been kneeling there all night. The tension thickened. Meanwhile, Father Thomas sought help from the only person who might still remember the events of 1980 clearly, Eleanor Greaves, the village historian. She had once worked with a convent to document religious texts and had kept meticulous records of Elmridge's past. Now in her 70s, Eleanor lived alone near the edge of the woods in a creaky old house filled with books and relics. When he visited her, she was already waiting at the door. "You've seen the signs, haven't you?" she said softly. Father Thomas nodded. Eleanor led him inside without another word. Her house smelled of old paper, lavender, and something faintly metallic. On her dining table were stacks of files, clippings, and photographs. She had been tracking things, strange disappearances, sudden deaths, unexplainable sounds, all tied to one peculiar pattern. Every 28 years, something stirred in Elmridge. The missing sisters weren't the first. In 1952, 4 children vanished while playing near the old mill. In 1924, 4 farmers were reported missing from their homes. Each case separated by exactly 28 years. Each group made of 4. Each disappearance ending with no trace. No bodies, no evidence, only silence. Eleanor pointed to a faded map of the village. Circled in red were 4 locations: the old well, the chapel, the riverbank, and the abandoned schoolhouse. Places where the 4 had vanished over the years. "This isn't random," she whispered. "It's ritual." Father Thomas felt a chill creep up his spine. But why them? Why always 4? "I don't know," Eleanor said, "but it's always women. Or children. Vulnerable. Pure." He looked down at the notes again. "Then the next should be soon." She nodded. "This year." That word hung in the air like smoke. Back at the chapel, Father Thomas couldn't concentrate. Every sound made him flinch. Every shadow seemed to move. He started locking the chapel at night, something he had never done in 40 years. But even that didn't keep the fear out. On one particularly cold evening, he received a visit from a stranger, a man in his late 50s, wearing a long dark coat and a cross that shimmered in the light of the chapel candles. He introduced himself as Vincent Carr, a former priest turned researcher who had spent his last 10 years investigating unexplained church-related cases across Europe. "I came because I heard what you found," Vincent said calmly, "and because I've seen the same pattern before." Father Thomas hesitated, but let him in. They sat at the back of the chapel, while Vincent explained that several remote parishes across Europe had experienced similar incidents, always in small villages, always with four, always 28 years apart. He pulled out a journal, filled with accounts from priests long gone. One entry from a German village in 1896 read, "The sisters lit their candles, but the shadows did not move. That night, we lost them, all four, and we never spoke of it again." Father Thomas felt his world narrowing. What do they want? Vincent looked at him with tired eyes. That's the question no one has answered. Outside, the wind began to howl. The next subplot quietly developed when Mary Ellis, a young volunteer at the parish, began having vivid dreams. She didn't tell anyone at first, but each night she would wake up gasping with the same image burned into her mind. The four missing nuns, standing in a circle, hands joined, eyes closed, whispering. Behind them, something watching. One morning, she came to Father Thomas, pale and shaking. "I saw them," she said, "and I think they saw me." He urged her to rest, offered her prayers, but deep down, he feared her dreams were more than dreams. Maybe whatever had taken the sisters was reaching out again, searching for the next four. Days later, Mary found a rosary on her doorstep, old, burned at one end. That night, she didn't sleep at all. The village slowly became aware that something was wrong. The older residents whispered about the past, but the younger ones noticed the present, lights flickering, phones ringing with no caller, doors opening by themselves. And then came the most chilling moment yet. At Sunday Mass, Father Thomas began reading from the book of John. But when he opened the Bible, the page had been altered, a single verse rewritten in blood-red ink. "And those who walk in light shall face the watchers, and not all shall return." The congregation fell silent. Father Thomas closed the book without a word and ended the service early. He knew now that something ancient, something buried, was waking again. And this time, it was closer than ever. Ask ChatGPT. The air in Elmridge had changed. It wasn't just colder, it felt heavier, like the village itself was holding its breath. People started locking their doors earlier. Shops closed before sundown. The streets, once quiet but peaceful, now felt watched. Even the birds seemed to avoid the chapel grounds. Something was coming, and everyone could feel it. Father Thomas spent his nights pacing the chapel. Candles lit, prayers whispered under his breath. The message in the Bible hadn't faded from his mind, nor had the letter from Sister Angela or the photograph with the dark figure lurking behind the nuns. All of it pointed to something dark returning, and he feared that the time was running out. Mary Ellis, who had been plagued by visions, had grown pale and distant. She barely spoke. She claimed the dreams were getting worse, that she could hear chanting now, whispers that followed her even when she was awake. One afternoon, Father Thomas found her kneeling before the altar, eyes wide, repeating the same phrase again and again. They're waiting in the dark. They never left. He gently helped her to her feet, but inside, he felt the weight of her words. If what she was seeing was connected to what happened in 1980, if the missing sisters were still somehow trapped or watching, then this was more than a mystery. It was a cycle, a ritual, and they were all part of it now. Meanwhile, Eleanor Greaves, a historian, discovered something buried deep within old parish records, an unpublished letter written by the first priest assigned to Elmridge in 1895. It was brief, almost frantic in tone, and described the exact same symbols found beneath the chairs in the sealed cellar. The priest had called them marks of warding, a form of protection used to bind something. But the letter ended with a warning. The marks are weakening. If they fail again, the watchers will seek balance. Must take their place, or the darkness will roam free. Eleanor brought the letter to Father Thomas the next day. He read it 3 times, then looked at her with hollow eyes. "What did we do in 1980? He whispered. "What were they trying to stop?" She didn't have an answer. As the days passed, Father Thomas began seeing things too. Glimpses of shadows that moved when nothing was there. Whispers that seemed to rise from the old wooden pews. One night, while sitting in the chapel long after midnight, he heard the sound of 4 sets of footsteps behind him, soft, deliberate. When he turned, no one was there. But the candle flames flickered sideways, as if someone had passed by. The parishioners began to feel it too. A mother claimed her toddler woke up screaming, pointing to the corner of the room, saying to the silent lady's back. A delivery driver refused to come near the convent, saying he saw 4 figures standing in the window even though the building was still abandoned. Then came the night that shook the village to its core. The bell tower rang 13 times. Unprovoked, unexplained. It was just past midnight. Those who lived near the church swore they saw lights flickering from inside the old convent. A few even claimed they saw a woman in a nun's habit walking through the graveyard. She didn't speak. She didn't look up. She just moved slowly between the tombstones, pausing now and then, as if remembering. The next morning, the grave of Sister Angela had been disturbed. But Sister Angela had never been buried. Her body had never been found. The marker was placed there by the village as a gesture of remembrance. Now, the soil was freshly turned, like something had risen. Father Thomas felt the panic rising. The box, the photograph, the dreams, the symbols. It was all leading to something. The pattern was repeating. And there was no doubt left in his mind that they were headed toward the climax of something ancient, something buried beneath faith, ritual, and silence. He called Vincent Carr, the former priest and researcher. They met in secret at the edge of the woods. Vincent brought with him an old journal from a Spanish monastery that had faced a similar mystery in 1908. The entry spoke of a veil between this world and another, one that thinned every few decades, allowing them to pass through. They fed not on flesh, but on faith, silence, and fear. And when they crossed, they demanded balance. Always 4. Vincent closed the journal and looked at Father Thomas with grim certainty. Whatever your sisters were trying to stop, they only delayed it. That night, Father Thomas gathered a few people he trusted. Eleanor, Mary, Vincent, and a young local named Jonah, who had recently discovered one of the cellar's strange symbols carved into the underside of an old chapel bench. Together, they returned to the sealed chamber. This time, they searched every inch. In the far corner, behind a stack of discarded hymnals, they found a hidden door, smaller than the main one, built into the stone wall, locked, but not with a key, with a symbol, a perfect replica of the one Mary had drawn from her dreams. The group stood in silence, staring at it. They didn't know what lay behind it, but deep down, they all felt it was the last door before the truth, or something worse. Mary began to cry quietly. "It's behind there. I've seen it." Father Thomas reached out, placed his hand on the symbol, and whispered the same prayer he had repeated every night since the sisters vanished. But nothing happened. The door remained shut. Suddenly, the candle Vincent was holding flickered violently and went out. In the darkness, they heard it, a breath, not their own, slow, deep, right behind them. When Vincent relit the candle, the chamber was empty, but the chairs had moved. Now they were closer. The group left in silence, locking the chapel behind them. No one spoke that night, but they all knew whatever was coming was nearly here, and they were running out of time. The following morning, the group met again in Father Thomas's study. No one had slept. Their eyes were tired, their nerves frayed, but something heavier than exhaustion hung in the room. The movement of the chairs in the hidden chamber wasn't just a coincidence. It was a message. Something had seen them. And worse, it had responded. Eleanor laid out more of her findings. She'd spent the early hours digging through her grandfather's old war journals, and what she discovered stunned them all. During the 1940s, Elm Ridge had briefly housed a military research station, hidden beneath the forest, cloaked as a supply post. Soldiers stationed there reported strange happenings in their final months. Nightmares, missing equipment, and even one case where 4 soldiers vanished during a routine patrol. No one ever spoke of it again, and the station was officially shut down. The twist came when she pulled out a faded black and white photo from the journal's back pocket. It showed the soldiers standing together near the ruins of an old stone building deep in the woods. But it wasn't the soldiers that drew everyone's attention. It was the structure behind them, covered in ivy, broken and weather-worn. It was the same hidden door from the chapel cellar, the same symbol. Father Thomas leaned in, stunned. That door existed before the convent was ever built. Vincent nodded slowly. This thing, whatever it is, it didn't start with the nuns. They just found it. Jonah, the youngest of the group, pointed to the bottom of the photo where a handwritten note read, "The watchers wait. They always wait." Mary turned pale. "That's what I hear in my dreams." It became clear they weren't dealing with just a haunting or a curse. They were standing on ancient ground, something older than the chapel, older than Elm Ridge itself, something bound by silence and rituals, breaking free again with every generation that failed to stop it. And now it was hunting for balance, for souls, always 4. That night, the second twist revealed itself, more violent than the first. The bells rang again, but this time at precisely 2:44 a.m. Every villager heard them, even those far from the chapel, but no one dared go outside. At sunrise, Father Thomas received a call. Jonah was missing. His mother had gone to wake him, but his bed was empty, the window open, and his shoes left neatly beside the door. Nothing disturbed. No note. Just a lingering smell of burning wax in the air. The group was shattered. He was only 18. He hadn't even believed in any of this until days ago. He was never supposed to be one of the 4. That's when Vincent said something that silenced the room. It doesn't matter if they believe. It only matters that they're chosen. Mary collapsed into a chair. Eleanor clutched her cross. Father Thomas stood in the middle of the room, his thoughts racing. If Jonah had been the first, then 3 more were needed to complete the pattern, and he could feel it coming. What if Mary was next? She had been dreaming for weeks, seeing things before they happened, feeling watched. She was marked long before any of them had realized it. The question now was, who were the other 2? He looked at Eleanor. At Vincent. Were they already chosen, or was it him? Mary was beginning to spiral. She spoke less and less, often drifting into long silences. She'd started writing symbols in her notebook. One she claimed she didn't recognize, though they matched the carvings in the cellar perfectly. She said the whispers were louder now, closer. Sometimes she didn't know if she was awake or asleep. Vincent suggested they leave the village, scatter, break the pattern. But Father Thomas knew it wouldn't work. This thing, it wasn't bound by distance. It was bound by time, by repetition, by unfinished promises. And then something strange happened. Late one evening, just after the sun dipped behind the trees, the chapel door unlocked itself. Father Thomas had locked it like always. Twice. He was sure of it, yet it stood open wide, as if inviting them inside. He and Vincent entered together, the others staying outside. The candlelight flickered despite the absence of wind. They walked slowly to the altar, where the sealed box now sat open, even though Thomas had hidden the key. Inside was something new, a folded piece of cloth. Fresh, clean, a nun's habit. Next to it, a rosary. Not burned this time, but glowing faintly in the low light. Vincent stepped back. It's starting again. The church groaned, like the walls themselves were breathing. Outside, Mary began to scream. Father Thomas and Vincent rushed out to find her collapsed on the stone path. Her eyes were wide, and she was pointing to the forest's edge. "They're here," she whispered. "They want us to follow." Eleanor helped her to her feet, but no one could see anything in the trees. Still, something felt wrong. The woods were darker than usual, too quiet. That night, they agreed to stay together. No one would be left alone. They moved into Eleanor's house. every light on, candles lit at every window, prayer whispered into the corners. But as the clock approached midnight, the candles began to dim one by one. And in the final moments before the hour struck, Mary sat up suddenly, her voice barely a breath. They're not just watching anymore. Outside, the bell rang once, then twice, then silence. They waited, holding their breath, waiting for the third chime. But it never came, and somehow that was worse. Ask ChatGPT. In the flickering candlelight of the old village church, Father Samuel stood in front of the hidden underground chamber, the wooden door trembling slightly in his hand. For days, the whispers had grown louder, the signs more vivid. The diary entries, the strange letters, the untouched rosaries found inside sealed drawers, they all led here. And now, after 28 years of silence, the answer to what happened to the four vanished nuns felt closer than ever. He opened the creaking door slowly, the stale air of decades rushing out, cold and dry like a sigh trapped in time. The chamber was dimly lit by the few candles Father Samuel had brought, their flames dancing along the rough stone walls. Shelves lined with old religious artifacts filled the room, crucifixes, chalices, veils, and journals. But what made his breath hitch was a mural painted on the back wall. For women in nun habits, their faces hauntingly detailed, standing around a symbol etched deep into the stone. It wasn't just a religious symbol. It was something older, more cryptic. Father Samuel stepped closer, noticing names written faintly beneath the figures. Sister Agnes, Sister Maria, Sister Ruth, and Sister Eliza. His hand trembled as he brushed dust from the final name. These were the missing women. But why would someone paint them here? Why underground? He heard footsteps behind him. Quickly turning, he found Mary Whitfield, now grown and with her own child back home, standing at the threshold of the chamber. "I followed you," she said, breathless. "I couldn't stay away. Something about this, it's been haunting me for years." Together, they examined the mural and the journals scattered around. One of them, bound in worn leather, bore Sister Agnes's name. Inside, pages told a chilling story, not being taken, but of choosing to stay hidden. Sister Agnes wrote of discovering something forbidden beneath the church, something not meant to be disturbed. She called it a sacred place, wrongly buried by men who feared its power. But it wasn't just a religious discovery. There were notes about visions, dreams shared between the four women, and voices in the silence that spoke of divine tasks. Agnes wrote about protecting the village from something ancient, something that lived beneath the chapel floors, something that had to seal away, even if it meant disappearing forever. As Mary read the entries aloud, her voice shook. They chose this. They locked themselves in to guard it. Father Samuel, overwhelmed, nodded. But why would no one know? Why wouldn't they leave even a single message for the rest of us? Mary turned a few more pages, finding something hidden at the back, a folded paper map drawn with red ink, marking a deeper tunnel beneath the chamber. Because, she whispered, it wasn't just about hiding something. It was about keeping us all from finding it. The next morning, they returned with tools, quietly digging through the earth near the spot marked on the map. After hours of careful work, their shovels hit stone. A slab with a strange symbol blocked the entrance to what looked like an older part of the church's foundations, forgotten and sealed shut long ago. Together, they pried it open, the heavy stone groaning as it shifted. Below, a narrow staircase spiraled down into darkness. They descended slowly, guided only by flashlights. The air was damp and heavy. At the bottom, they found a small circular room. In its center stood 4 stone pedestals, each bearing a nun's name, with rosaries and candles resting on top. But it was a 5th pedestal, unmarked, cracked down the middle, that chilled them both. Before Father Samuel could speak, a sound echoed to the chamber, a soft humming, like chanting from far away, carried through hidden tunnels. The flame of his candle flickered wildly. "This isn't over," he whispered. Suddenly, Mary gasped, pointing at the wall. Another mural, newer than the others, had been painted in what looked like recent years. It showed the 4 nuns again, but this time they weren't alone. A 5th figure stood between them, taller, shrouded, its face blank. And beneath it were the words, Etched deep into the stone, the Watcher returns. "What does that mean?" Mary asked, her voice trembling. Father Samuel didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the fifth pedestal, where something now shimmered faintly. Not just a rosary, but a small vial glowing softly. He picked it up, the light pulsing like a heartbeat. "I think we've only uncovered part of the truth," he said. They weren't guarding something, they were containing it. Just then, the chamber trembled slightly, and a cold gust of wind blew out their candles. Mary grabbed Father Samuel's arm. "We need to leave. Now!" They rushed back up the stairs, the tunnel behind them groaning, as if the earth itself was waking. Dust and loose stones rained down as they reached the surface. The old chapel, silent for decades, now hummed with an uneasy energy. They sealed the entrance behind them, but both knew it was only a temporary measure. As they stood in the quiet graveyard behind the church, the sky above turned gray. Father Samuel looked back at the chapel, then down at the glowing vial in his hand. He had hoped for answers. Instead, he'd found a warning. And across the village, unnoticed by either of them, the old bell in the abandoned nuns' quarters tolled for the first time in 28 years. Once, then twice, then silence. The Watcher had returned. The storm that raged through the village that night seemed to carry away not just the weight of the years, but the final veil that had long hidden the truth. As dawn broke, soft golden light filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Bridget's Chapel, where Father Nolan now sat alone in the pew where it had all begun. Everything felt different, heavier and lighter all at once. The discovery beneath the old rectory had left more questions than answers, but for the first time in 28 years, there was a feeling of peace. And yet, the silence still hummed with something unspoken. The remains found beneath the chapel floor had been positively identified. Sister Agnes, Sister Helena, Sister Ruth, and Sister Mary had finally been found. Their bones were respectfully recovered and given proper burial after decades of being hidden beneath the place they once prayed and served. For the villagers, the funeral was not just a moment of closure, it was a reckoning. People came from surrounding towns, old friends and former parishioners, all gathering to pay their respects. Many wept quietly, not just for the nuns, but for what had been lost in all those years of uncertainty. Father Nolan delivered the eulogy with a steady voice but heavy heart. He spoke of the kindness and selflessness of the sisters, their quiet dedication, and how their absence had changed everything. When he finished, there was a long pause. No applause, no murmurs, just a collective silence that felt like a shared breath held too long. But not everything was resolved. The letter found in the old wall, signed by Father Malcolm, still haunted Nolan. Though the confessional booth had been removed years ago, the memory of what it may have held remained like a shadow on the altar. Some believed that the sisters had discovered something so dangerous or controversial that it cost them their lives. The contents of the letter suggested secrets within the church, decisions made in darkness, and silence maintained to protect something or someone. Father Nolan handed the letter to church authorities. Within weeks, officials came down from the diocese, conducted interviews, reviewed records, and eventually issued a vague statement about a tragic series of events from the past that did not reflect the values of the church. But no names were mentioned. No explanations were offered publicly to the village. It felt like a door closing just as they were finally ready to walk through it. Still, Nolan didn't stop searching. He met with older parishioners, spoke to retired clergy, and even traveled to a neighboring city to speak with a former housekeeper who had worked at the rectory in 1980. It was there he learned the final piece of the puzzle, not from evidence, but from a memory. The housekeeper, now in her 80s, recalled how Sister Mary had been worried during her final weeks. She had discovered discrepancies in church funds, donations unaccounted for, charities that didn't exist. She had confronted someone, but never said who. That week, all 4 nuns went missing. The housekeeper had assumed they'd been reassigned, like so many others before them. But now, hearing of the discovery, she broke down in tears. Back in the village, Nolan gathered the community for one final meeting. In the same chapel where so much pain had grown in silence, he now stood and told the truth, as much as he knew, at least, about the misused donations, about the letter, about the likelihood that the sisters had uncovered a hidden financial scheme tied to someone inside the church. He didn't name names, he couldn't, but he asked the people to forgive, not to forget, to honor the sisters not just by mourning them, but by restoring the trust that had been broken. The villagers listened. Many cried. A few left, but most stayed, not for answers, but for healing. Weeks passed. Life returned to the small village. Children played outside the chapel again. Bells rang softly every Sunday morning. And Father Nolan, now older, wearier, but somehow lighter, tended his parish with quiet devotion. Still, the mystery lingered. No arrests were made. No further investigations announced. But something had changed. The chapel, once shrouded in unanswered questions, now stood as a place of remembrance and reflection. The mural that had once been hidden behind the old altar, painted by Sister Ruth, was restored. It depicted the four sisters holding lanterns, walking through a dark forest, their light leading the way. A plaque beneath it read, "In light we remember." One evening, as the sun set behind the chapel, Nolan sat in the garden where the nuns had once tended roses. A young girl approached him, curious, wide-eyed. She asked about the mural, about the sisters, about why they had left and never come back. Nolan smiled gently, offering a few words that held both truth and grace. They followed the light into a place where others were afraid to go. And now we walk in the path they made. The girl nodded, then ran off to join her friends. And just like that, life moved forward. For those who had lived through the nightmare, it would never be forgotten. But in the gentle rhythm of village life, in the return of faith and community, there was something stronger than mystery: hope. The chapel no longer stood as a monument to loss, but as a symbol of how truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way to the surface. In the end, the mystery of the four vanished nuns was never fully explained. But maybe it didn't need to be. Maybe the answers weren't in names, or arrests, or headlines. Maybe they were in a legacy the sisters left behind, in courage and compassion, and in the quiet resilience of a village that chose to remember not the fear, but the light. And as Father Nolan looked out over his parish one final time before retiring, he knew something for certain. The story wasn't just about what was lost. It was about what was found when the silence was finally broken. Ask ChatGPT.